Curious and skeptical, a millionaire decides to investigate the story of Padre Pio. But what he discovers is something astonishing, a secret that few know, and the revelation changes everything. The black Mercedes cut through the winding road with the same precision its driver conducted business. Richard Ashton adjusted the air conditioning, trying to escape the suffocating summer heat. His hands, firmly gripping the leather steering wheel, were the only indication of the tension consuming him after yet another failed meeting with suppliers in rural Illinois. The numbers weren't adding up. 3 supermarkets in his chain showed consistent drops in sales, and competitive pressure had begun to scratch at the fortress he'd built over 30 years. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his 54 years on his shoulders. He wasn't a man who accepted defeat. Every cent of his fortune had been earned through relentless determination and an absolute conviction that everything in life could be calculated, predicted, and controlled. The GPS indicated another 2 hours until Chicago. His back ached, and a headache began to insinuate itself at his temples. That's when he spotted a sign indicating a small town 5 miles away. Contrary to his own habits, he decided to make a stop. 15 minutes, he muttered to himself, as if needing to justify this deviation from his meticulously planned routine. The town was like so many others in rural America, a central square, some old stores, and a church that stood out against the modest landscape. Richard parked in the shade of a leafy tree near the church. The silence of the place instantly bothered him. He was accustomed to the constant noise of his supermarkets, the hustle of meetings, the sound of shopping carts and cash registers. His steps involuntarily led him to the church entrance. The heat pushed him inside, seeking momentary relief. The interior was empty, except for a few candles lit near the altar. The smell of incense hit him like a wave, bringing with it a strange, almost nauseating sensation. Something about the environment deeply disturbed him, as if the walls held secrets he didn't want to discover. That's when he noticed the presence. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, was sitting on the first pew. Her feet barely touched the floor, and she swung her legs gently as if following music only she could hear. Richard couldn't explain why, but he felt his heart race. There was something in her eyes, dark and deep, that seemed to suck all the light from the room. "You shouldn't be here yet," the childish voice echoed through the empty church, making the hairs on Richard's neck stand up. He tried to respond, but the words got stuck in his throat. The girl turned her face toward him, and a strange smile formed on her lips. "Your mother, Helen, used to say that some things can't be explained by reason." Richard's blood ran cold. Helen, the name he hadn't heard in more than 40 years, the name he tried hard not to remember. How could that child know? "Who are you?" His voice came out trembling, unrecognizable. "Emma," she answered simply. "The attic still exists, you know, the one where you used to hide when your father came home drunk. The marks from your fingernails are still in the wood floor." Richard staggered backward, his legs weakening. Nobody knew about the attic. Nobody. These were memories he had buried so deep that sometimes he managed to pretend they belonged to someone else, to another life. "This is impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Impossible is a word people use when they're afraid of the truth," Emma responded, her voice carrying a disturbing maturity. "You've lived with fear for so long that you've forgotten what it's like to look beyond the numbers." Sweat ran down Richard's forehead, and his vision began to blur at the edges. He needed to get out of there. He needed to get back to his car, to his world of spreadsheets and reports, where everything made sense, but his feet seemed nailed to the church floor. "Father Ezekiel should be arriving soon," Emma continued, as if chatting about the weather. "He'll be surprised to see you here today. He always says some encounters are inevitable, no matter how much we try to avoid them." As if summoned by the girl's words, an elderly man emerged from a side door. His tired eyes widened at the sight of Richard, and the rosary in his hands visibly trembled. "Mr. Ashton," his voice was barely a whisper, "we weren't expecting... not today." Richard finally found the strength to move. He backed toward the door, his Italian shoes echoing on the stone floor. Is this some kind of joke? How do you know these things about me?" The priest stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Please, Mr. Ashton, there are things we need—" "No," Richard cut him off, his voice louder than he intended. "I don't want to hear anything else. This is madness." He turned and practically ran out of the church, the afternoon sun hitting him like a slap. Inside the car, his hands trembled so much he could barely turn the key in the ignition. As he drove away, at high speed, he looked in the rearview mirror. Emma was standing on the church steps, her small figure silhouetted against the white facade. And even at that distance, Richard could swear he saw tears running down the girl's face. That night, in his penthouse apartment in Chicago, Richard couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face, heard her voice mentioning things that should have been lost in the past. After hours of tossing and turning in bed, he got up and went to his office. He turned on the computer and began to research. The small town, the church, anything that could rationally explain what had happened. That's when he found something that made his heart stop. A small newspaper clipping, dated exactly 54 years ago, reported the abandonment of a newborn at the door of that same church. The date of abandonment was precisely the day and hour of his birth. The following days became a confused blur for Richard. During meetings, his mind constantly wandered back to that afternoon in the church. Emma's eyes haunted him in every reflection, in every shadow. Her words echoed in his mind like a disturbing mantra. For the first time in decades, he began making mistakes in his spreadsheets. "Mr. Ashton, are you all right?" Rebecca, his assistant of 15 years, asked for the third time that morning. She had never seen him like this, distracted, almost absent. The man who used to have answers for everything now seemed lost in his own thoughts. "Cancel my appointments for today," he abruptly replied, grabbing his car keys. Rebecca tried to argue about an important meeting with investors, but he was already in the elevator. His hands sweated as he held the steering wheel, driving back to that small town. The church looked different in the morning light, less threatening, but no less mysterious. Richard found Father Ezekiel sweeping leaves from the small side garden. The old man didn't seem surprised to see him. "I knew you would return," said the priest, leaning on his broom. His tired eyes carried a weight that Richard hadn't noticed before. "But I'm not sure you should have." "I need answers," Richard demanded, his voice betraying the anxiety consuming him. "How does that little girl know about my mother? About the attic? And why was she abandoned exactly when I was born?" The priest sighed deeply, looking at the sky as if seeking guidance. "Some questions are like locked doors, Mr. Ashton. Sometimes it's better not to have the key." "Don't give me metaphors," Richard exploded, his usual composure shattering. "I've spent my entire life building certainties. I won't let a child and a priest destroy everything with whatever this is. Have you ever wondered why you built so many certainties?" Emma's voice came from behind him, making him turn abruptly. She stood at the church door, wearing the same simple dress as the other day. "Why you need so much control?" Richard felt his legs weaken. There was something in her gaze that completely disarmed him. "You don't know anything about me." He tried to sound firm, but his voice failed. "I know about the scar on your left wrist," she said softly. "The one you made when you were 12, when your father broke the picture frame with your mother's photo." The world seemed to spin around Richard. That memory was so deeply buried that he himself rarely thought about it. Instinctively, his right hand grabbed his left wrist, where a thin white line was still visible under his shirt sleeve. "How?" he whispered, falling to his knees on the garden's dirt. "How can you know that?" Father Ezekiel approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Emma has a special gift, Mr. Ashton. She sees beyond the masks we wear, beyond the walls we build." "A gift?" Richard laughed bitterly, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "This is madness. Gifts don't exist, miracles don't exist, everything has a logical explanation. How do you explain that we've never been able to place Emma for adoption?" the priest asked softly. "All the families who tried to take her mysteriously gave up. It's as if she were waiting for something, or someone." Richard stood up abruptly, brushing the dirt from his expensive pants. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to manipulate me. You must have investigated my past, discovered these stories somehow." But as he spoke, his own words sounded hollow. How could they have discovered the attic, the scar, the most intimate and painful moments of his childhood? "You had a teddy bear named Toby," Emma continued, her voice even softer. "It was brown with a blue ribbon. Your mother sewed the ribbon the night before." "Stop!" Richard shouted, his hands covering his ears like a frightened child. "I don't want to hear any more." But it was too late. The memories he had suppressed for so long began to emerge like bubbles in boiling water. The smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of breaking glass, the screams, the silence that came afterward. "Please," he begged, not knowing exactly to whom or for what. "Please." "Richard," Emma approached, extending her small hand toward him. "Some truths hurt because they need to hurt. Like a broken bone that needs to be realigned to heal properly." He recoiled from the extended hand as if it were a snake about to strike. Stumbling over his own feet, he ran to the car. The engine roared when he floored the accelerator, leaving a cloud of dust behind. On the way back to Chicago, his mind was racing. Images from his childhood mixed with Emma's face, creating a kaleidoscope of memories and fears. When he arrived home, he went straight to the bar and poured himself a double whiskey, something he hadn't done in years. Sitting in his office, looking at the city stretching below his penthouse, Richard realized something fundamental had changed within him. The certainties that had guided his life began to crumble like a sandcastle hit by the tide. That night, for the first time in 40 years, he dreamed of his mother. In the dream, she held a brown teddy bear with a blue ribbon and cried. When he woke up, his own tears were wetting the pillow. The following week turned into a nightmare for Richard. Sleep, once as disciplined as his work routine, became hostile territory filled with long-buried memories. Each night brought a new fragment of his past, the smell of burnt coffee on tense mornings in his childhood, the sound of his father's heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, the gentle touch of his mother's hands trying to protect him. At his supermarket headquarters, rumors began to circulate. The always impeccable Richard Ashton now appeared with deep, dark circles under his eyes, his tie slightly crooked, his graying hair disheveled. In meetings, his gaze seemed distant, as if he were chasing invisible ghosts. "The third quarter numbers are concerning, Mr. Ashton," commented Charles, his financial director, during a presentation. Richard barely listened. His thoughts were fixed on a small church in a rural town, on a girl with deep eyes who knew too much. "Mr. Ashton?" Charles's voice brought him back to reality. The meeting room was silent, all eyes on him. "Do you have any guidance on how to proceed?" Richard looked at the projection screen, but the graphs and numbers seemed jumbled, meaningless. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a ready answer. Let's continue this tomorrow," he muttered, rising abruptly and leaving the room in shock. In his office, he locked the door and collapsed into his leather chair. His hands trembled as he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, revealing an old wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside, yellowed by time, was a newspaper clipping, the obituary of Helen Ashton, deceased at 32. The text was short, impersonal. "Death by natural causes," it said. But Richard knew the truth. His mother didn't die of natural causes. She died of sadness, of fear, of despair. She died a little each day under the fists and words of a violent husband, until her heart simply gave up. As he held the clipping, a sudden memory hit him. His mother, the night before her death, sewing a blue ribbon onto his teddy bear Toby. "So you'll always remember there's beauty in the world, my love," she had said. The next morning, he found her motionless in bed, an empty pill bottle on the nightstand. The phone on his desk rang, brutally tearing him from the memories. It was Rebecca. "Mr. Ashton, there's a call. It's from Father Ezekiel." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. How did the priest get his number? "Put him through," he ordered, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Ashton," the priest's tired voice sounded on the line. "Emma is having nightmares. She wakes up screaming your name." A shiver ran down his spine. "What do you want from me?" "It's not what I want," the priest answered softly. "It's what needs to be done. There are things you need to know, truths that need to be revealed. But not over the phone." "I'm not going back to that church," Richard declared, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "She drew something today," the priest continued, ignoring his declaration. "An attic with fingernail marks on the floor and a brown teddy bear with a blue ribbon." The newspaper clipping slipped from Richard's trembling hands. How can she know about the teddy bear? I never told anyone. Never." "There's more, Mr. Ashton. Much more. Emma is not just a child with a gift. She is a messenger. And her message is specifically for you." Richard closed his eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. "A messenger of what? From whom?" "From Father Pius," Ezekiel answered, his voice now almost a whisper. "He always knew this day would come, that you would need to face your past to find your redemption." "Father Pius, the Italian saint? This is absurd. I'm not even Catholic." "Truth doesn't care about our beliefs, Mr. Ashton. It simply is. And now it's knocking at your door through Emma." A muffled sound caught Richard's attention. Silent tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto his mahogany desk. He couldn't remember when he had started crying. "Emma asked me to tell you one more thing," the priest added. "She said your mother doesn't blame you, that she understands why you kept the pill bottle in your pocket that morning before calling the ambulance." The phone slipped from Richard's hands, hitting the desk with a dull thud. That was his deepest secret, his darkest guilt. At 10 years old, he found his mother still breathing, the pill bottle beside her. Instead of immediately calling for help, he put the bottle in his pocket, fearing his father would save her only to continue torturing her. When he finally called for help, it was too late. At that moment, sitting in his luxurious office, Richard Ashton, the man who built an empire based on logic and control, began to sob like a child. And somewhere in a small rural church, a girl with deep eyes was drawing his tear-covered face. That night, for the first time in his adult life, Richard drank until he lost control. Empty whiskey bottles accumulated in his penthouse as he wandered through the rooms like a ghost, dragging with him the weight of 44 years of guilt. In his alcoholic delirium, the apartment walls seemed to transform into those of the old attic, and each shadow took on the threatening form of his father. Dawn found him collapsed on the office sofa, still clutching his mother's obituary clipping. His head throbbed, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the agony tearing at his soul. Father Ezekiel's words echoed in his mind. A messenger from Father Pius. The idea was absurd, but no more absurd than a child knowing his most intimate secrets. Rebecca nearly fainted when he appeared at the office wearing the same clothes as the day before, his eyes swollen and red, exuding a strong smell of alcohol. "Cancel all my appointments for the week," he ordered, his voice hoarse, "and arrange a complete investigation of that church in the countryside. I want to know everything about Father Ezekiel and especially about the girl." "Mr. Ashton," Rebecca hesitated. "The board is concerned. There are rumors about your behavior, about your ability to—" "My ability?" He laughed bitterly. "I built this empire from nothing. I survived hell to get here. Nobody will question my ability." But as he shouted, his own words sounded hollow. What was his empire now? A fortress built on foundations of denial and trauma? How many times had he stepped over people, ignored feelings, suffocated his own humanity in the name of success? The following hours dragged on like decades. Each report that came in about the church only increased his despair. Father Ezekiel had been there for more than 30 years, known for his devotion to Father Pius. As for Emma, the records were confusing and contradictory. Different families had tried to adopt her over the years, but all gave up under mysterious circumstances. "It's impossible," he muttered to himself as he read the reports. "There must be a logical explanation." That's when he found something that made his blood freeze. Among the documents was an old photo of the church, dated the day of his birth. In the corner of the image, partially visible, was a woman leaving, a baby on the steps. Even in the grainy photo, worn by time, Richard recognized the blue shawl, the same one his mother constantly wore. His hands were shaking so much he could barely pick up the phone. "Rebecca, prepare the car. I need to go to that town now." "But sir, it's almost night and—" "Now!" he shouted, knocking a stack of papers off the desk. The journey seemed endless. Each mile was torture. Each curve in the road brought a new wave of anxiety. When he finally reached the church, the sun had already set, and only a few candles illuminated the interior of the temple. Father Ezekiel was sitting on one of the pews, as if waiting for him. "Are you finally ready to hear the truth?" The poo. "Photo." Richard pulled the document from his pocket, his hands trembling. "This woman, this shawl—" "Yes," the priest answered softly. "It was your mother." But how? Why?" "That night," the priest began, his voice heavy with grief, "your mother wasn't alone in the hospital. While you slept in the attic, she gave birth again." The world seemed to disappear beneath Richard's feet. "What?" "Twins, Mr. Ashton, you and your sister." "No," Richard staggered backward. "That's a lie. I would know." She would have told. "Your mother knew your father would never accept 2 children. He barely tolerated one. So she made the most painful choice a mother can make. She brought the girl here, entrusting her to the church's care." At that moment, Emma emerged from the shadows. Her dark eyes, so familiar now, shone with unshed tears. "The story doesn't end there. Richard, there's more, much more you need to know." Richard fell to his knees, his legs no longer supporting the weight of the truth. His entire world, all his certainties, were crumbling around him. And amidst the rubble of his reality, a single question echoed in his mind. Who was Emma, really? "Please," he whispered, tears flowing freely down his face. "Please, I can't bear any more truths today." But fate, like Emma, wasn't willing to wait. The girl approached, her steps echoing in the sepulchral silence of the church. "Some truths can't wait 44 years to be revealed," she said, her voice carrying a weight no child should know. The silence of the church was broken only by the sound of Richard's contained sobs. His knees hurt against the cold floor, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the turmoil in his mind. A sister. He had a sister. Why had his mother never told him? Why had she taken this secret to the grave? "Your mother tried," Emma said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "On the last night when she was sewing the blue ribbon on Toby the bear, she wanted to tell you. But you were so scared, so fragile. She couldn't add that weight to your small shoulders." Richard raised his tear-filled eyes to the girl. There was something in her face, something familiar he couldn't explain. "How do you know this? How can you know what happened that night?" "Because she told me." An elderly, trembling voice sounded from the church entrance. A white-haired lady, leaning on a cane, walked slowly toward him. Her eyes, though tired, carried a spark of determination. "Sister Mary Augusta," Father Ezekiel introduced her. "She was here that night when your mother brought the baby." The old woman approached Richard, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "Your mother arrived on a rainy night, hugging a small bundle. She was desperate, saying she needed to protect the girl from the monster she had at home. She knew her husband wouldn't accept 2 children." Richard felt his stomach turn. "And the child, what happened to her?" "Sophie," the nun gently corrected. "Your mother called her Sophie, after your grandmother. She grew up here, under our care. She was a special girl, with an extraordinary gift for understanding people, for seeing beyond appearances." Richard's voice failed. "Sophie passed away 6 years ago," Father Ezekiel intervened, his voice heavy. "But before that, she left us something precious, or rather, someone." The world seemed to stop spinning. Richard looked at Emma, really looked for the first time. The same dark, deep eyes as his mother, the same face shape, the same gentle expression, even in the face of pain. "No," he whispered, understanding hitting him like lightning. "It can't be." "Emma is your niece, Mr. Ashton," Sister Mary Augusta confirmed. "Sophie's daughter. And like her mother, she was born with a special gift, a gift that Father Pius, in his infinite wisdom, knew would be necessary to heal old wounds." Richard staggered backward, leaning on a church pew. His niece. The girl who knew his deepest secrets, who knew his most intimate pains, was his twin sister's daughter. A sister he never knew, who lived and died just a few miles away. "Why now?" he asked, his voice choked. "Why after so long?" "Because you weren't ready before," Emma answered, approaching. "Great Uncle Pius knew you needed to hit rock bottom first. You needed to feel that all your certainties were false, that all the control you thought you had was just an illusion." "Great Uncle Pius?" Richard raised his eyebrows, confused. "Your grandmother was Father Pius's niece," explained Father Ezekiel. "Something your mother discovered only in the last days of her life, when she received an old letter. She tried to tell you along with the truth about Sophie, but I found her too late that morning," Richard completed, tears returning with full force. "And the medicine bottle, I could have—" "No," Emma firmly interrupted, taking his hand. "Grandma Helen doesn't blame you for that. She never did. She understands you were just a scared child trying to protect her the only way you knew how." The touch of Emma's small hand was surprisingly warm, comforting. It was as if, through that contact, all the pain accumulated over decades began to find an escape valve. "But there's more," Emma continued, her voice now more serious. "There's something you need to see, something your mother left for you, kept all these years." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. How much more could his reality shatter in a single night? How much more could his heart bear? "In the sacristy," Father Ezekiel nodded. "There's a box your mother left in the church's care. She said that one day when you were ready, when the right moment came, you should receive it." "And how would she know?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because Father Pius promised her," Emma answered simply. "Promised that he would ensure the truth would come to light at the right time, and that time Uncle Richard is now." The path to the sacristy seemed endless to Richard. Each step echoed in the church's silence like a drum, announcing an execution. Father Ezekiel walked ahead, holding a candle that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls. Emma held his hand firmly, as if fearing he might crumble at any moment. The sacristy was a small, simple room with a strong smell of wax and incense. From an old dark wooden cabinet at the back of the room, the priest carefully removed a cedar box. Time had darkened the wood, but it was still possible to see the initials carved on the lid. H.A. Helen Ashton. "Your mother brought this box the same night she left Sophie," explained Sister Mary Augusta, who had followed them. "She said it contained the truth that would one day need to be revealed." With trembling hands, Richard took the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. An old key hung from a faded cord tied to the handle. "Sit down," Emma suggested, indicating a simple chair. "What's in here? You'll need strength to face it." Richard obeyed mechanically. The sound of the key turning in the rusty lock seemed deafening to his ears. When he finally opened the lid, the smell of old paper and stored memories filled the air. The first thing he saw was a letter, the envelope yellowed by time, sealed with red wax. His name was written in his mother's delicate handwriting. Below it were a dark beaded rosary, old photographs, and a brown-covered notebook. "She wrote this on the last night," Emma said softly. "After sewing the ribbon on Toby, when she already knew she wouldn't see another dawn." With fingers he could barely control, Richard opened the envelope. The letter inside was perfectly preserved, as if it had been written yesterday. "My beloved son," he began to read aloud, his voice failing. With each word, "If you are reading this, it means the moment Father Pius foresaw has finally arrived, the moment when the truth can no longer remain buried." Richard stopped, unable to continue. Tears blurred his vision, turning the words into indistinct blots on the page. "Would you like me to continue?" Emma gently offered. He nodded, passing her the letter with trembling hands. "The secret I carry," Emma continued reading, "is much greater than just your twin sister. Sophie wasn't separated from you only because of my fear of your father. There was something more, something I discovered that night in the hospital, something that changed everything." Emma's voice filled the sacristy as she read the revelation. Helen had kept for so long. With each word, Richard felt his world shatter even more. The truth was much deeper, much more painful than he could have imagined. "Your father wasn't who we thought," the letter continued. "In fact, he wasn't your father. The truth about your origin, about the blood that runs in your veins, is connected to a story that began much earlier, in a small village in Italy." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. At the bottom of the box, an old photograph showed a young woman, his mother, beside a man wearing a Franciscan habit. The man's face, even in the faded photo, was unmistakable. Father Pius. "This is impossible," he muttered. "It's not impossible," Father Ezekiel softly intervened. "Your grandmother wasn't just Father Pius's niece. She was his confidant, his protector. And when your mother discovered the truth about her own history, about the miracle that was connected to the birth of her twin children—" "Miracle?" Richard interrupted, his voice trembling. "Your mother was destined never to have children," Emma explained, her voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "But on a night of desperation, she turned to Great-Uncle Pius, and he made a promise. Not only would she have children, but they would be special. They would carry a gift that would one day help heal old wounds and bring light to darkness." Richard looked at the girl, his niece, with new eyes. Her gift, her inexplicable connection to the past, to people's deepest pains. Could it be possible that he also— "Yes," Emma answered his unformulated thought. "You have the gift too, Uncle Richard. But you've spent so long hiding behind numbers and logic that you've forgotten how to listen to your heart, how to see beyond the visible." A gift. The word echoed in Richard's mind like a distant bell. How many times during his childhood had he felt things he couldn't explain? How many times had he known exactly what people were feeling, thinking, suffering? But after his mother's death, after all the tragedies, he had buried that sensitivity so deep he had almost forgotten it. "Keep reading," he asked Emma, his voice hoarse. "Please." The girl picked up the letter again, her dark eyes shining in the candlelight. "My son," she continued, reading Helen's words, "I know you must be wondering why I kept so many secrets, why I didn't tell you about Sophie, about your true origin, about the gift that runs in our blood. The truth is that I was afraid, not just of the man we thought was your father, but of the weight this truth carried." Richard closed his eyes, letting the memories emerge. He remembered the countless times his mother had looked at him strangely, as if wanting to say something important, but always restraining herself at the last moment. "The man you knew as father," the letter continued, "discovered part of the truth on the night I died. He found an old letter from Father Pius, discovered about the gift, about the prophecy. That's why he became so violent that night. It wasn't just about the pills I took. It was from fear of what you might become." Richard's breathing became heavy. Long repressed memories began to surface. The screams on that last night, words he had never fully understood. "He's an aberration," his supposed father had shouted. "This child isn't normal." "You hid in the attic," Emma continued reading, but now she seemed to be describing the scene as if living it. "Your fingernails scratching the floor as you tried not to hear the fight. That's when it happened for the first time, wasn't it? When you felt her pain so intensely you thought your own heart would stop." Richard opened his eyes abruptly. Yes, he remembered. That night, lying on the attic floor, he had felt something, a connection so deep with his mother that he could feel each weak beat of her heart, each shallow breath, each moment as life left her body. "That's why you kept the pill bottle." Emma lowered the letter, looking directly at him. "You didn't just fear she would be saved only to continue suffering. You knew through the gift that she wanted to leave. You felt her decision, her desire to find peace." A sob escaped Richard's throat. All his life he had carried the guilt of that decision, convinced he had killed his mother by not immediately asking for help. But now, the memories returned with crystal clarity. He had felt her choice, had shared her last moment of peace. "After that," Father Ezekiel gently intervened, "you began to build walls. Each brick of logic, each layer of rationality was an attempt to silence the gift that screamed inside you." "And it worked," Richard admitted. his voice breaking. It worked so well that I truly believed there was nothing beyond what could be explained, measured, controlled. But the gift never disappeared, Emma said, taking his hand. It's there, in every intuitive decision you made in business, in every time you knew exactly what a customer or employee needed before they even spoke. You just gave it another name. You called it instinct, experience, cold analysis. Richard looked at their intertwined hands and felt, for the first time in decades, that old familiar sensation. It was as if he could see through Emma's eyes, feel her unconditional love, her deep understanding, her connection to something greater than herself. Your sister Sophie, Sister Mary Augusta spoke for the first time in a long while, never denied her gift. She embraced it, used it to help people, to heal emotional wounds, and before she left, she knew her daughter would be the catalyst to bring you back to the truth. But why now? Richard asked, though he was beginning to feel the answer. In his heart. Because you're finally broken enough to be fixed, Emma answered with simplicity. Sometimes we need to lose all our certainties to find the only truth that matters. And what is that truth? He whispered. That you were never alone, Emma smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. That every moment of pain, every decision, every step you took, even those that took you away from who you really are, was part of a greater plan. A plan that began with a promise made to Father Pius and that now, finally, is being completed. At that moment, sitting in the small sacristy, surrounded by truths hidden for so long, Richard Ashton felt something awaken within him. It was as if a long-locked door finally opened, letting in a light he had forgotten existed. In the cedar box, beneath the letters and photographs, Richard found an old rosary, made of dark beads worn from use. His hands trembled as he touched it, a wave of emotions instantly overwhelming him. It was Father Pius's, Emma explained softly. He gave it to your mother on the night he made the promise. She was holding it when you and Sophie were born. As he held the rosary, Richard was flooded with sensations he couldn't explain. It was as if each bead held memories, emotions, moments that weren't his, but which he could feel with frightening clarity. He saw his mother, young and desperate, kneeling before Father Pius. He felt her fear, her hope, her unwavering faith. I'm going crazy, he muttered, trying to drop the rosary. But his fingers seemed glued to the beads. You're not, Father Ezekiel answered firmly. You're just remembering how to use your gift, how to see beyond the veil that separates past from present. At the bottom of the box was a small, worn diary. When Richard opened it, he immediately recognized his mother's handwriting. The pages were filled with notes about him and Sophie, little moments, observations, signs of the gift they both carried. March 12th, he read aloud, his voice trembling. Richard today consoled the neighbor who had lost her husband. At just 4 years old, he held her hand and said exactly the words she needed to hear. How could he know she blamed herself for their last argument? More memories began to surface. Moments from his childhood that he had dismissed as coincidences, explained through logic or simply buried deep in his mind. Sophie did the same, Sister Mary Augusta commented. From a young age, she knew exactly what people needed. She spent her entire life helping others carry their pains, find peace. And that killed her? Richard asked, a lump forming in his throat. No, Emma answered, her eyes fixed on his. Mom chose to fully live her gift, even knowing it meant deeply. Feeling others' pain, she left in peace knowing she had fulfilled her purpose. Richard continued leafing through the diary, each page revealing more about the life he could have had, about the sister he never knew, about the gift he had denied for so long. June 15th, he read another entry. The twins have a connection. That goes beyond normal. Today, when Richard fell and hurt his knee, Sophie, even on the other side of town, began to cry and hold her own leg. Father Pius was right. They aren't just siblings, they are two parts of the same blessing. That's why you can feel everything so intensely, Emma explained. It's not just your own gift, it's also the part that belonged to Mom. When she left, that connection passed to me. Emma's words hit Richard like lightning. All the times he had felt that inexplicable melancholy, that feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just his mother's absence he felt. It was the absence of his other half, of Sophie. "But I denied it," he whispered, tears flowing freely down his face. "Denied all of this. I built an entire life based on numbers and logic, rejecting anything that couldn't be explained." "And yet," Father Ezekiel intervened, "your gift found ways to manifest itself. How many times were your business intuitions right? How many times did you know exactly what an employee was going through, even without them saying a word?" Richard closed his eyes, letting recent memories emerge. He remembered all the times he had made seemingly illogical decisions that proved to be correct, how he could read people and situations with a precision his consultants could never explain. "Your empire wasn't built just with logic and numbers," Emma said softly. "It was built with a gift you refused to recognize, but that never abandoned you." At that moment, something inside Richard began to transform. It was as if decades of denial and rationalization began to dissolve, making room for a truth he had always known but never had the courage to accept. "There's more in the diary," Emma continued, her voice now carrying a note of urgency. "There's something you need to see, something your mother wrote on the last page, something that explains why everything needed to happen exactly this way." With trembling hands, Richard turned the pages of the diary until he reached the end. The last entry, written on the same night his mother passed away, made his heart stop for a moment. The last page of the diary was stained with old tears, Helen's handwriting more unsteady than usual. Richard needed a few moments to focus his vision and begin to read. "My son, if you are reading this, it means the moment Father Pius predicted has finally arrived. He told me you would build walls around yourself, that you would transform your heart into an impenetrable fortress. He said it was necessary, that only through the deepest pain would you find your true purpose. Tonight, as I sew the blue ribbon on Toby, I can feel my time is coming to an end. But I'm not afraid. Father, Pius showed me the future. I saw you and Sophie separated but connected by something greater than distance or time. I saw the empire you would build, not for yourself, but for a purpose you don't yet understand. Your supermarkets, Richard, aren't just commercial establishments. They are places where broken people seek more than food. They seek comfort, hope, a moment of peace in their troubled lives. And you, even without realizing it, have been using your gift to create these spaces of healing." Richard stopped reading, his hands trembling violently. He remembered all the times he had insisted on hiring employees others considered problematic, how his supermarkets had become known for their welcoming environment, how people in difficulty always seemed to find help in his stores. "Continue," Emma gently requested. "There's more." With a deep sigh, he resumed reading. "Sophie will grow up protected by the church, fully developing her gift. She will help hundreds of people, heal old wounds, bring light to darkness. And one day, through her daughter, she will help you awaken to your true nature. What you consider your greatest guilt, not having saved me that morning, was actually your first act of true compassion. You felt my decision, my need to leave, and in your child's heart, you understood and respected my choice. It wasn't cowardice, my son. It was love in its purest form. But there's something else you need to know, something that will change everything. You believe about your life, about your purpose. On the night I visited Father Pius, he didn't just promise I would have children, he made a prophecy. He said my twins would be part of a greater divine plan, that through them an ancient promise would be fulfilled." Richard raised his eyes from the diary, meeting Father Ezekiel's gaze. The elderly priest nodded gravely. "The prophecy," he explained, spoke of two siblings who would carry a special gift. One would build a material empire that would serve as a foundation for something greater. The other would develop the spiritual gift that, through their descendant, would bring the necessary healing. Together, even separated, they would prepare the way for a profound transformation. "What transformation?" Richard asked, his voice almost a whisper. "The supermarkets you built," Emma answered, "aren't just commercial establishments. They are points of light, places where broken people find hope." And now that you're finally awakening to your gift, they will become something even greater. Centers of healing, Sister Mary Augusta completed. Places where people like you, like Sophie, like Emma, can use their gifts to help those who suffer. That's what Father Pius saw, a network of sacred places disguised as common establishments. Richard felt the weight of that revelation settle on his shoulders. His entire empire, built with such determination and coldness, had a greater purpose than he had ever imagined. "But there's still more," Emma said, her dark eyes fixed on his. The last part of Grandma Helen's letter explains why it had to be this way, why you needed to suffer so much to reach this moment. With trembling hands, Richard turned his eyes to the last page of the diary, where his mother's final words waited to complete the transformation of his world. Richard took a deep breath before reading his mother's last words. "My beloved son, the last part of this truth is the hardest of all. The man you knew as father wasn't a monster by nature. He was consumed by fear of the gift he saw in you. On the night he discovered Father Pius's letter, he didn't go mad just with anger, but with terror, because he too had a secret. He came from a lineage of people who denied similar gifts, who chose darkness instead of light. You needed to grow up with him, needed to see what happens when someone completely rejects their true nature. You needed to build your own walls, dive into the deepest denial, to one day truly understand those who live trapped in their own emotional prisons. Each moment of pain, each tear shed in the attic, each year lived in denial, all this was preparation. Because only one who has known the deepest darkness can truly help others find the light." Richard stopped reading, feeling his heart tighten. Memories of his stepfather, the man he thought was his father, flooded his mind. He remembered the moments of terror, but also the brief instance when he saw something more in his eyes. Fear, confusion, an old pain he had never understood. "He had the gift too," Emma said softly. "But he was taught from childhood to fear it, to deny it. Each act of violence was a desperate attempt to silence something that screamed inside him." "How do you know this?" Richard asked, his voice choked. "Because he came here," Father Ezekiel answered, "years after your mother's death. He was aged, broken, seeking forgiveness. That's when we discovered the rest of the story." With trembling hands, Richard returned to the diary. "Your real father, my love, was a good man, a man of faith. He died before you were born, but his blood, the same blood that runs in Father Pius's veins, carries an ancient blessing, an ability to feel, to heal, to understand the deepest pains of the soul. The empire you built wasn't just the fruit of your determination. It was your gift finding a way, even through all the barriers you erected. Each employee you hired when everyone else rejected them, each customer who found consolation in your stores, each life that was touched without you realizing, all this was your true self operating in the shadows of your denial. Now, through Sophie's sacrifice, the circle is complete. Your supermarkets will become what they were always meant to be, beacons of hope disguised as common establishments, places where broken people will find not just nourishment for the body, but healing for the soul." Tears flowed freely down Richard's face as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. His entire life, which he thought he had built with logic and control, had been guided by something much greater. "But how?" he asked, looking at Emma. "How to transform stores into healing centers?" "You've already begun," she smiled. "Gently. Each employee you instinctively hired, each manager you chose not for their experience but for something you felt. They are like us, Uncle Richard, people with similar gifts, just waiting for someone to help them awaken." Father Ezekiel approached, holding Father Pius's rosary. "This rosary isn't just a relic, it's a symbol of what you must do now. Each bead represents a life that will be transformed, each prayer a person who will find healing through what you and Sophie built." "Sophie knew all this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "She always knew," Sister Mary Augusta answered. "That's why she chose to remain here, quietly helping people, preparing the way. And that's why she left Emma, to be the bridge between the two worlds that you and she built. Richard looked at his hands, now stained with the tears that had fallen on the diary. Hands that had signed contracts, counted money, built an empire. Hands that, he now realized, had always carried a power much greater than material wealth. The following days passed like a feverish dream for Richard. Back in Chicago, he began to see his empire with new eyes. Each aisle of his supermarkets now told a different story. Each employee carried a potential he had never consciously perceived. Rebecca, his assistant of many years, was the first to notice the change. One morning she found him silently observing the movement in the main store, silent tears running down his face. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, concerned. "I'm seeing for the first time, Rebecca," he replied, his voice choked, really seeing. And he truly was. Now that he had accepted his gift, the sensations hit him like waves. He could feel the pain of the elderly woman at Register 3, who had recently lost her husband. He perceived the anguish of the young shelf-stocker fighting against dark thoughts. He understood the fear of the pregnant woman counting coins to buy basics. "Rebecca," he called softly, "why did you choose to work here?" The assistant hesitated, surprised by the unexpected question. Actually, it was strange. 15 years ago, when I came for the interview, something told me this was the right place. Even when I received better offers elsewhere, something always kept me here." Richard nodded, understanding. His gift had recognized something special in her, even when he refused to believe in such things. That afternoon, he called a meeting with all the managers. Looking at their faces, he realized it wasn't just competence that had led him to promote them. Each one carried a special spark, an innate ability to understand and help others. "From today," he announced, his voice firm, "we will implement some changes. Each store will have a community space, a place where people can sit, talk, find comfort." The managers exchanged confused looks, but Richard could feel something more in their reactions, a kind of recognition, as if a part of them had always known this would happen. "We will also create an emotional support program for employees and customers," he continued. "Not just traditional psychological assistance, but something deeper." That's when his phone vibrated. It was a message from Emma. "The lady at Register 3 needs you now." Without hesitation, Richard excused himself and went down to the store. The elderly woman was there, her hands trembling as she tried to check out her purchases. He approached gently. "Mrs. Miller," he called, surprising himself by knowing her name without ever having heard it before. "May I speak with you for a moment?" In the minutes that followed, in a discreet corner of the store, Richard did something he had never done in all his years as a businessman. He simply listened, not just with his ears, but with his newly awakened gift. He felt the pain of loss, the loneliness of empty nights, the fear of the future. And then, without thinking, he held the woman's wrinkled hands in his. "Joseph is at peace," he said softly, the words coming from a place he didn't know. "He wants you to know that the garden you planted together will continue to bloom." The woman's eyes widened. No one knew about the garden. It was a private project of the couple, their last gift of love before the sudden heart attack that took Joseph. How do you know?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Sometimes," Richard answered gently, "we just need to open our hearts to understand what was always there." That night, alone in his office, Richard took Father Pius's rosary. Each bead seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if each prayer whispered on them over the years had left an invisible mark. His phone rang again. It was Emma. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked without preamble. "With the lady with the garden?" "Yes," he answered, his voice trembling. "It was like I could see through her, feel her pain, but also her hope." "That's how it begins," Emma said softly. "But there's more, Uncle Richard, much more. What happened today was just the first step. Tomorrow I need you to come to the church. There's one last thing you need to know, something that will change. Everything. What could change more than what's already changed?" he asked, a shiver running down his spine. "The real reason why Mom left so early," Emma answered, her voice now carrying a deep seriousness. "And the true purpose of your gift. It's not just about helping people, Uncle Richard. It's about something much greater, something that began long ago with a promise made to Father Pius. The next morning, Richard found the small church bathed in a different golden light. Emma was waiting for him on the steps at the entrance, wearing a simple white dress that made her seem even more ethereal than usual. "Welcome to the last chapter," she said, extending her small hand. Inside the church, Father Ezekiel and Sister Mary Augusta were already waiting for them. On the altar there was something covered by a white cloth. "Before the final revelation," Emma began, her voice carrying a secular maturity, "I need to tell you about Mom's, Sophie's, true sacrifice." Richard felt his heart tighten. He sat on the first pew, firmly holding Father Pius's rosary. "Sophie didn't die from natural causes," Emma continued. "She chose to leave when she discovered her gift was becoming too strong, when she realized she could change the natural course of things." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. "Your gift, Uncle Richard and Mom's, wasn't just about feeling or healing. It was about much more. It was about changing destinies, altering the very fabric of reality through love and compassion." Father Ezekiel approached, carrying an old book. Father Pius predicted this. He spoke of two siblings who would carry the power to rewrite stories of pain into stories of redemption. But that power had a price. Sophie discovered this when she began to realize she could not only feel people's pain, but literally change it, Sister Mary Augusta explained. She could touch someone and rewrite their past, transform tragedies into blessings. But each time she did this, she lost a bit of herself, Emma completed, tears glistening in her eyes. Each story she changed consumed a part of her own story. Richard felt the world spin. "And I? Can I also—" "Yes," Emma answered simply. "Why do you think your supermarkets became places of healing? Unconsciously, you were rewriting stories, all the time. Each problematic employee you hired had their past gently altered through your gift. Each desperate customer found not just consolation, but a real change in their life narrative. But then, why am I not disappearing like Sophie?" "Because you built something physical first," Father Ezekiel explained. "Your supermarkets are anchors, places where the gift can manifest without completely consuming its bearer. Sophie didn't have that. She used the gift directly, without protection." Emma walked to the altar and removed the white cloth, revealing an old mirror. This mirror belonged to Father Pius. He said that one day when the siblings finally met, even if one had already departed, the truth would be revealed. Richard approached the mirror, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. When he looked at his reflection, he almost fell backward. Beside him, clear as day, was Sophie, not as she would be today, but as the young woman he never had a chance to know. "She's here," Emma said softly. "She always has been. Part of her lives in me, part of her lives in you, and together we can complete what Father Pius predicted." "What exactly did he predict?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A network of sacred places disguised as common establishments," Emma explained. "Your supermarkets will be the first. Places where people not only buy food, but have their stories rewritten, not in a dramatic or miraculous way, but through small changes, subtle transformations that alter the course of their lives." "And you?" Richard asked, finally understanding. "What's your role in all this?" "I'm the guardian," she smiled, "the one who ensures the gift doesn't consume its bearers, the one who maintains the balance between what can and what should be changed." At that moment, looking into the mirror, Richard saw his reflection change. He was no longer just the cold, calculating businessman, nor just the frightened boy from the attic. He was someone new, someone complete, someone who finally understood his true purpose. "And now?" he asked, feeling a peace he had never known before. "Now," Emma answered, taking his hand, "we truly begin to live the story that was always ours. No longer separated by pain and fear, but united by the gift that was given to us. And through us, through the places you built and the power we share, other stories will be rewritten." No longer stories of pain, Father Ezekiel added, but stories of redemption. In the mirror, Sophie's reflection smiled one last time before disappearing. But Richard no longer felt pain or loss. For the first time in his life, he felt complete. The boy from the attic had finally found his way home. And so, in a small rural church, Father Pius's prophecy was finally fulfilled. Not with grandiose miracles or dramatic revelations, but with the simple and profound understanding that sometimes the greatest transformations happen in the most common places through the power of love and compassion.